Okay, so welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we are going to be looking at a speech by Donald Trump, and this is from, I think, March 12th, 2023, so just a few days ago.
Yeah.
And he's talking about the war in Ukraine,
Yeah.
and he's got a lot to say, and there's some points that are worth pulling out to consider. So let's just get right into it and see what we think about it.
Okay.
So one of the very first things he says, and this is sort of just a broad overview, is talking about the U.S. financial aid to Europe. And he throws out this number right away. He says $350 billion in aid to Europe. And I mean, that's just like, wow, that's a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
And it really makes you
It's a massive amount.
think about, like, what is our level of commitment and how does that compare to what other countries are doing?
Right.
What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a very deliberate move on Trump's part to highlight that figure right at the beginning because, it plays into this idea that the U.S. is footing the bill for a lot of international conflicts and people in the United States that was going to hear that number and they might have some feelings about it, like, is that too much? Are we shouldering out too much?
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think that, I mean, I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on, like, how that plays out on the international stage?
Well, I think it definitely, contributes to that tension that already exists, between the U.S. and our European allies. This idea of burden sharing is a big topic within NATO. And, I think this kind of rhetoric can definitely make it worse. And it also, when we talk about the money that we're spending, it plays into the hands of people who advocate for, a more isolationist foreign policy. They say, hey, we shouldn't be spending all this money overseas. We should be focusing on problems here at home. So,
Right.
And the other thing I think to remember is that, the whole world is watching how the U.S. is responding to this crisis. And
The signals that we're sending, they have long-term repercussions.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so moving on from that, he also gets into the human cost of the war. And I think, it's very easy to get caught up in, like, all the, strategic discussions and the politics and everything.
Right.
But he says very specifically, there's 2,500 young people dying every week.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's just a stark reminder that there are real people dying.
Right. And those numbers are, unfortunately, pretty much in line with what we see in other large-scale conflicts.
Oh, right.
But what I think is really interesting about how Trump presents this is the way that he uses this to make an emotional appeal.
Okay.
He's not talking about, soldiers or casualties. He's talking about young people.
Yeah.
He's personalizing the loss. He's forcing us to think about the individuals, the families, the communities that are affected by this conflict, and the long-term trauma that's inflicted, by these kinds of events. So it's a very powerful rhetorical technique. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And he says something really kind of out of left field. He says that he's actively involved in talks with both Russia and Ukraine, and he's pushing for a ceasefire.
Right.
I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, it's definitely a bold claim. And one that raises a lot of questions. We know that back-channel diplomacy does exist, but the specifics here are very vague.
Right.
It could be that he's having informal discussions with individuals who are connected to Putin or Zelensky, maybe leveraging some of his past relationships to try and, open up lines of communication.
Right.
But the real question, I think, is, how much influence can a former president actually have in a situation like this? It's a very complex geopolitical situation.
Right. And especially, do you think, I mean, I'm just curious, do you think that he can really achieve anything given the current state of things? I mean, it seems like both Putin and Zelensky are very entrenched in their positions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for any negotiation to be successful, it has to address some of those fundamental issues.
Right.
For Putin, it's about achieving his strategic objectives in Ukraine.
Right.
For Zelensky, it's about preserving, Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Right.
And then, of course, you have the broader international community, with its own set of concerns about, setting dangerous precedents and rewarding aggression.
Right. And of course, we have to talk about this. He says that the war wouldn't have happened if he was president. And and he talks about his relationship with Putin. He says it was good. It was professional.
Yeah.
Well,
this is where I think we really get to the heart of the debate surrounding Trump's foreign policy approach.
Okay.
He argues that his personal rapport with Putin combined with his, unpredictable nature, served as a deterrent,
Right.
But his critics, they argue that Putin's decision to invade was based on a much longer-term strategy, and a perceived weakness in the West, regardless of who was in the White House.
Right, yeah. And it's hard to know. I mean, we'll never know the answer.
We can't know for sure.
To that question.
Yeah,
exactly. Okay, so another really, kind of hard-hitting thing that he brings up is he talks about the Ukrainian soldiers who were trapped by Russian forces.
Right.
And this is
a very stark illustration of just how brutal war can be.
Right.
We're talking potentially thousands of soldiers who are cut off, facing impossible choices.
Right.
Surrender, a desperate attempt to break out, or worse.
Right.
And their fate, has significant implications, not just for the overall, military balance, but also for morale on both sides.
Right. Yeah. And it's just, it's a really difficult situation to even contemplate. So, I guess, as we kind of try to wrap this up, I mean, what would you say are the main takeaways here from Trump's speech?
Well, I think it's clear that it's a very interesting blend of his own personal perspectives, geopolitical analysis, and some pretty optimistic claims.
Yeah.
But what I'd like you to consider is the question of individual agency in a conflict like this.
Okay.
Can a single person, even a former president, truly alter the course of a war of this magnitude?
Right.
And if so, what role, if any, should past leaders play in these active international conflicts?
Right.
There are no easy answers to these questions, but I think they're definitely worth pondering.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something for all of our listeners to think about.
Absolutely.
So thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.
You're welcome.
We'll see you next time.
Okay, see you then.